me, I think they'll allow recording. Recording in progress. Woohoo! Yeah, give a hand to Monique O'Brien. All right, let me start about 2 minutes ago, okay, about this agreement and a bill of sale so we can have it on the recording. Do not include it as an addendum on your offer to purchase because it would affect the loan or could affect the loan. This is a standalone agreement, and once it's signed, you want to make note right here where this agreement is or is not contingent upon the seller and buyer closing on the offer to purchase and contract for the real property dated, whatever the date of your offer purchase is. That's the connection between the offer to purchase and the personal property. Most of the time, the seller doesn't want to sell the property if they're not selling the house, right? But this gives you the option if they do want to sell the property without selling the personal property without selling the property. I like this up here. Let me point this out to you. This for the sum of money, which we would say a minimum or $10 or zero, does hereby agree to sell and to transfer to the buyer free and clear of all claims, liens, and encumbrances, any and all rights and interests in the following personal property. I'm not sure why they gave you such a small space here. Maybe they were just giving you a space to put that patio furniture, but sometimes you might have several pieces. If you need to add a blank sheet of paper to list items, just put C attached, okay? So you want to make sure that any item that is going to be transferred as personal property is listed somewhere. No, don't make any assumptions, okay? You rarely see a long list, a really long list, like a furnished home. But if you do, you make sure every item is itemized. Now let's go back down here. If this agreement is contingent, then the buyer and seller must close on the contract of the real property in order for this agreement to be enforceable. All right. So again, this is very serious right here. Don't miss those two little check boxes. This basically, anything you see that's bold or capitalized, you want to take note of it. And it says the parties agree to the following. And again, this is where you're going to have the agreement if there's any warranties in place that they can be extended or can be assumed. You might want to have some of those. You want to make sure that the buyer understands that the seller is not going to be responsible for anything after he conveys it to the buyer. So the buyer accepts any and all risks associated with the personal property, including any potential liabilities. I'm not going to go through details of that because I don't know all that is, but you all will, as you get into it, can discern that. Right here, I think this is important. This agreement may only be modified by a written document signed by the parties. This agreement is governed by the North Carolina law. Sometimes when you're talking with the buyer and the seller, and they might have a verbal agreement, they might have verbally said, well, sure, I'll leave the gas logs. They're attached nowadays, but let's say they said, surely I'll leave something. Don't take that verbal as a part of this agreement. Make sure everything is itemized out, and if it's not on this piece of paper, it doesn't count. Okay. Right here, buyer is strongly encouraged to investigate any potential taxes, fees, and costs of the personal property prior this document. I don't know exactly what's made, but at the same token, have your buyer do their due diligence on anything that they're purchasing from the seller. There could be something, possibly they buy a boat, say with the property or whatever. I want to make sure that. So it's pretty straightforward. The main thing of it is that you make sure to have a standalone agreement. Okay, that was the only totally new agreement. All right. This referral agreement, this is something you've seen for years. It has only been modified, amended some by the words. Now, a referral agreement is supposed to be firm to firm, not individual agent to individual agent. And sometimes there's some confusion, particularly in our Keller Williams model that we do agent to agent referrals. When you have an agent to agent referral, it needs to be backed up with the referral agreement, because that is firm to firm. And if you'll notice on page 2 here, this should be the firm name. This should be by the authorized representative, which would be your broker in charge, whose title would go here. Now, I have no problem at all. In fact, I like it if you will add your name, add a signature block here for your name. That way it kind of ties for me and Lynn as we're looking at referrals. But that's the way it's designed, whether it's the referring company, firm, or the receiving firm. Now the only change that the form actually was, the only change to the form is right here. The end date, a contract has to have a beginning and an end, okay? The beginning is obviously when it's signed. The end date should be right here. It says end date. If the prospect closes and sells more than one property prior to the end date, the referring firm shall be paid on each transaction unless otherwise provided herein. I don't know if any of you have had this situation, but the thing that comes to my mind most is when you get a referral for a seller and you go out to take and they're going to buy something, and I will help them buy something. Therefore, I will get 2 transactions out of this. And then I get the call to say, do I have to pay them on the buy side too? They only referred the seller side. Well, right here's your clarification. If there is more than one transaction during the term that's listed here, such as a sell and a buy, then you would have to pay on both of them. So this end date, whether it is on a sale or a buy, it's more often like a year. Some of the relocation companies put 2 years when they give a lead. But I think a year is not unreasonable. 6 months, if you want to, y'all can negotiate whatever period of time you want. I just want you to be aware that any transaction with that person that's been referred, you get paid on 2 or 3 or multiple transactions. That makes sense? Okay, that's on the buy or sale. So that end date, if you're referring, you definitely want a longer period of time. If you're receiving, you might have a shorter period of time, but I would suggest a year on a referral agreement. Okay, that's all that we need to look at on the referral agreement.
Sabra, can I ask a question about referrals?
Sure.
So hypothetically, you work with a client and then 2 years later, they want to purchase another property or sell that existing property.
They're free game. They're free game unless they're free game. You can work with them unless they would have unless you had the second transaction within that period of time that we were just talking about.
Okay. So then I would not owe them anything.
No.
But it would be a nice gesture because they were the referral for beginning.
Well, it would be a nice gesture, but you have nothing in writing, nothing to support it.
Got it. Thank you.
That would be something you might go back and negotiate. Maybe you would do a lesser referral fee, but you would not be required to, because it's not in your referral agreement.
Got it. Thank you.
Having said that, you get it from Minnesota. So you have to watch each of the each of the referral agreements and see what their specifications would be as to a term. Watch the term. Once you know the end of the term, beyond the term, you are under no obligation. That makes sense? Cool. All righty. All right, let's take a look now at the buyer agency agreement. There were 2 or 3 things that they made changes on our buyer's agency agreement. One being the previous version had a date right up here, and it goes down here and starts talking about the effective date. And there was some confusion on that. So they eliminated the date that it was signed. And now it says the buyer represents that as of the effective date of this agreement, the buyer is not a party to a buyer representation agreement. You know how I love this paragraph, and I tell you, if I was you, I'd have some initials right here to say I've discussed it with you. Now, initial here that you understand. All right, I know it's not part of the form, but I just kind of do that because buyers are. Now I won't say buyers are liars. Well, I say buyers typically or often don't remember they signed a buyer's agency agreement with somebody else, and then you get into this conflict. To clarify, it's not the date that you signed it, it's the date that it goes into effect, which is the day you as an individual agent and the party sign it. So hopefully that will clarify a little bit what the beginning is. So, but the date that everybody has signed it, you as the individual agent and the term shall begin on the effective date. All right. Now let's go down and look at this right here. You know, we've all had to deal a lot with this compensation paragraph this past year, as we've had to address the buyers may possibly having to sell to pay some of our commission because of the low offers from the seller. But I'm not going to discuss that today, but I do want to point out something to you right here. Per federal regulations, a buyer obtaining a VA loan is not permitted to pay a brokerage fee or commission in connection with the services of a buyer's agent, even though the use of a buyer's agent is permitted. Firm may still seek compensation pursuant to paragraph 4B1 if buyer is seeking a VA loan. That means we can still seek to be paid by the listing firm. We had this happen, maybe 6 or 7 months ago. I'd never heard of it, quite honestly, but we did have it. One of our agents was working with a buyer who agreed to pay, if I'm not mistaken, it was like $7 or $8, $9,000. I mean, it was a pretty hefty amount. And the buyer wanted this property. They couldn't get it out of the MLS. They couldn't get the listing agent to agree. And the buyer said that they would pay it. And we got right down to the day before when we were going over the CD, and they didn't have that buyer's agent extra fee on there. And they explained to us that with a VA loan, the buyer cannot pay the buyer's agent. And when I read this, I thought, wow, so evidently there must have been more than one person get stuck on that this year. But just be aware with the VA buyer, you might not get it, even though the buyer wants to compensate you. You will not get it because they won't allow it. So that's pretty sticky, but just ding, ding, ding with a VA buyer. Okay, now let's see. Let's scooch on down here a little bit more. There it is. The effective date is the date the last one of the buyer and firm signs this agreement, and such signing is communicated to the other party. It's not just the signing, it has to be communicated. All right. So that's when it becomes binding. And anything that's written in here is what is being bound to the agreement. All right, let's go on down here. And I believe that's all the changes to the buyer's agency agreement. Yeah. Now let's look at this right here. The agency agreement renewal and or amendment. Boy, do we use this little form. It's a very handy little form. I wasn't sure where to put this with the buyers or with the listings, because somehow I seem to see it more on the listing side than we do on the buyer side, obviously with changing from firm exclusive to active in MLS, or some of the different things that we use, and changing the price and all that. They have clarified this right here. All terms and conditions of this agreement, including any previous amendments to this agreement, not specifically amended herein, shall remain in full force and effect. So we have a couple of other amendments, whatever they would be. Those are going to stay in effect unless you amend the amendment. So if you have, let's say you had one that changed the price, all right, obviously that would have been done on this form. Then when you change the percentage that you will pay the buyer. Seller is offer, say 2%. Okay. If the seller is going to offer 2% and you're going to get agreement by the buyer to pay, let's say 1%. You need it on this form. The buyer will agree to pay 1% of the commission. That is not going to change the price of the amendment we had just previous to this. All amendments, unless you specifically change that amendment on this form, would stay in effect. When you are talking to your buyers about the MLS offering when they offered like 2% or less than what they have agreed to pay you, let's say they agree to pay you 3%. Remember, we have the right to collect that 1%. But when you go to closing, you don't give your buyer's agency agreement to the closing attorney. So you need something in writing that the buyer not only understands, but agrees that they will pay that 1%. That is, it's further clarification on your and the buyer's part, but you then can give this document to the closing attorney and you have it in writing that they are to take that 1% off the buyer side to pay your commission. So just see right here, just make sure you realize that all addendums must be either amended or they stay in full force. All right, let's now get to the biggie. Okay, here's your offer to purchase. They reformatted a couple of things right up front. For some reason, we're still having challenges with the mobile homes that get included in the offer to purchase. So now they've just simplified the statement. The property will or will not include a manufactured mobile home. Simple statement. Second statement, the property will or will not include an off-site and or separate rush. That's the time you see that phrase, but that's the biggest change in all of our forms this time. It has to do with those itemized items. the separate septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit. If one of those are included in the purchase, then we want to use Form 2A 11-T. That's your additional provisions addendum. We're going to go look at that just 1 second. If a manufactured home or septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit is included, it says the buyer and seller are strongly encouraged to include further details. Okay, now let's scooch on down here and let me show you what they have added. And there's some other places we'll be seeing it. In fact, there's 4 or 5 places we're going to see it, but I wanted to kind of tie it together with the offer to purchase first. Let's see, come on down here. Whoops, went too far. There it is. You all are probably familiar with this particular form. It's the additional provisions addendum. Right here on the second page, this is again some clarification about an off-site separate septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, storage unit. You see right here, this is the sale of the property shall include the following. Possibly it's a deeded boat slip, or it could be a leased storage unit. It could be seller owned. It could be HOA owned septic lot, which would often would be the case. A boat slip, we don't see that much. You have to know that in the boat slip, does it go with the property? They're putting a lot more responsibility on the listing agent and the buyer's agent, primarily the listing agent, on knowing this. Of course, the seller should be to include them, and we have seen them in our own office. Not even, I guess a week or so ago now, we have had an issue about parking spaces, like in a garage for a condominium. Underneath the condominium, they would have reserved spaces, and then they'll say there's some spaces for guests. But if you have a tenant in there and that tenant decides to take the liberties of parking in the guest spot, they get towed, and then there's consequences there. So be very careful on those parking spaces when they are assigned. We have the same problem sometimes with garages that are separate from a condominium, because some garages are part of the deed to that condominium. There are other condominiums in that unit, in that building even, that might not have a garage. So anything that's in addition to what's within those 4 walls or whatever, if it's part of this offer to purchase, you've got to specify it and find out who owns it, and is there a transfer fee? Can it be sold with the unit, or is it a separate transaction? So you might have to even work with the attorney on this, who would have the title and who own it, and who would possibly be able to clarify what is owned. Sometimes the sellers don't even know. I would hope they would, but there's a lot of responsibility now being put back on the sellers to know some of this. But you and I both know we have to go verify it, right? So they have included this. They have included lines for you to describe what might have to take place in order for the ownership to transfer, or to say it doesn't transfer if it's not deeded. While we're here, let me show you this. This was a change. This was an addition. This right here is the manufactured home. Since I here, we want to make sure that you have homes located on the property, and you're going to put the VIN number. Or if the VIN number is unknown, then try to get the year and the model of the mobile home. That mobile home, before it can be sold, is going to need to be detitled. And so you want to make sure with the motor vehicle department of motor vehicles, that it has been detitled if you're selling it as real property. If it is not being sold as real property, then it's going to be a personal property. So that has to be noted on there. Now let's go back up here to our contract. I don't think we're going to go through the offer to
Hey,
purchase.
Sabra,
Yes, sir.
for garages, is that like off-site, off the property garages, or what about detached that are in the back lot of the property we're selling?
Oh, if it's on the property you're selling, you shouldn't have any problem.
Okay,
Where you run into problems is when it's a condo and there's several owners, and some owners have the deed to those garages and some don't.
sure, makes sense.
Does that make sense? Okay. All righty. Let's see. All right. So we just would take a look at that additional provisions addendum. Now, let me show you right here a couple of clarifications they have made. Boy, don't we have a challenge with getting DDFs to the sellers. And looky here. See that little word "own"? That's the new change. Delivered to the seller on the effective date. Remember what the effective date is. On the effective date. They've tried their best to make it as clear as possible. Well, what is the effective date? And some people say, well, within 24 hours of signing the contract, it says on the effective date. So if it was signed at 10 o'clock at night on the 24th, it's delivered on the 24th. Nothing they're dealing with, and I don't know, some of you all have had some maybe some solutions to this issue of the wire transfer on the due diligence fee. Sellers don't particularly want to give out their accounts for it to be wired into, but at the same token, how are they going to get some of these sizable checks from DDF if they don't wire it? It can certainly be delivered in cash. No, don't take cash. Can't fake copies. Personal check or official bank check or wire transfer or electronic transfer. But the sizes of these DDFs right now, you can't get it through on Venmo and Zelle. It's too large. You would have to do several different transactions, and it has to be over a period of not just one 24-hour period, but another 24-hour period. So wiring has seemed to be the better option. Some of the agents have been asking the attorneys if they can have it wired to their account. The attorney doesn't particularly want to do that because the attorney has nothing to do with the DDF other than giving credit for it. So it's not unreasonable to think that a seller might be able to change something about the account, but nevertheless, we're running into some challenges on that. Tom, have you seen any solutions to that wiring on DDF?
That's always the problem when you've got out of town buyers. Like you said, the due diligence fees now are upwards of 20, 30. I've even seen $50,000 in due diligence fees, which doesn't do good if you're trying to negotiate repairs. It pretty much is a done deal.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an issue.
Yeah, it is.
And then also too, like the earnest money, we have to deposit earnest money with the attorney now. So, that could be a challenge too.
Yeah.
But like you said, you can wire the funds to the attorney for the earnest
We
money.
don't have as much trouble with wiring the attorney, but you always want to make sure they talk verbally. And I was telling one of the agents hospital on when you're putting an account out there. So
Well,
It's
that's
been-
exactly right, because,
Mhm.
you know, the attorneys, well, they specifically state that only take the wiring instructions from them because the rampant fraud of people hacking in emails and stuff.
oh goodness, yes. Oh yeah. So it has to be verbal. So again, you don't generally want to put buyer and seller together, particularly the very first day. But on wiring, that's just about the only way you can do it if you're gonna have the wiring. Okay, speaking of earnest money, they put a little clarification in here, is that the earnest money named in paragraph 1F, which is on page 2, within 5 days of the on the North Carolina forms, sellers or listing agents, to protect your sellers, be very conscious of those 5 days and verify that the funds have been received by the attorney. And if they're good funds, or if they're dishonored for any reason, make sure that the seller knows they have the right to send that form 355. That's a notice to the buyer that they are to deliver cash or wire funds to cover that amount within the period of time, within 24 hours or 1 business day, basically. So if the seller wants to put some pressure on the buyer to get that money, they would use the 355. If they choose, after they've given the 355 and that 1 day business day notice, if they choose to terminate the contract at that point and move on from that buyer, it's their choice. They have the unilateral right to do that. Sellers, I mean, that's a big decision. You know, you have to see how strong that buyer is otherwise. But if the seller doesn't have the money within that period of time, they can exercise that right, terminate the contract unilaterally, and put the house back on the market. Notice right here, if the parties agree that the buyer will pay any fee or deposit described above by electronic or wire transfer, the seller agrees to cooperate in effecting such transfer, including the establishment of any necessary account and providing any necessary information to the buyer provided. However, the buyer shall be responsible for additional costs, if any, associated with such transfer. I understand what they're saying. I'm not really sure that a seller is going to set up a separate account in order to receive those funds, but it could very well be the safest thing to do. But how are they going to know to do it ahead of time unless they've already determined to have it done when they do get a contract? But just kind of think through the logistics of that. But they have actually put it in the contract that they might need to have another receptacle of the money instead of their own personal checking account. So talk to the sellers about it, listing agents. All right. Right here about the earnest money deposit. The earnest money deposit will be credited by closing or dispersed as required by this contract. There were 2 or 3 sentences that that seem to expound on that, but they've simplified that to say it's going to be dispersed according to this contract. Again, they're clarifying the effective date. You know, that's one of the definitions in the offer to purchase. This sentence was added. The parties further acknowledge that the effectiveness of this contract is not contingent upon the buyer's payment of any earnest money. Your listing agreements, or as buyer's agents you've seen, it says you know, that until they receive the due diligence fee, they're not gonna change the date in MLS, or they're not going to allow inspections. Can't do that. And they put this little sentence in there to clarify that. The listing agent does not, or the seller's agent does not have a right to hold up the buyer's inspections. I mean, you think, well, that's not right because the buyer hasn't fulfilled the term of the contract. But they're telling us we cannot hold up inspections, and we cannot hold up any right for the buyer because the seller has not received the due diligence or earnest money. So to be aware of that, no holding up inspections. All right. Okay, let's scooch on down here a little. Okay, list of personal property. We're kind of familiar with this long list of personal property, but look what they've added. Exercise equipment or devices that are attached. Tell me what exercise equipment is attached. Do any of y'all have exercise equipment that's attached?
So
Like,
some of the exercise
wait.
equipment like dumbbells and benches and so forth, they attach to the wall and fold up to save space.
Okay, okay.
Weight,
What else?
weightlifting equipment that's bolted to the floor.
Okay. What, anything else?
My kids built what's called a rack in the garage, and that is also bolted into the studs.
Okay.
And it
Okay.
holds weightlifting equipment. Yeah.
Okay, so if it's bolted in, yeah, and secure, obviously securely attached, it stays. All right. That's why
Probably also basketball goals or like punching bags that are attached.
Oh, punching bags. Yeah, cool. Well, that's why I wanted to hear y'all say some of these things to kind of point it out, because obviously it has become an issue, or we wouldn't have it listed in our personal property. One of the things that we faced this spring, attached, but then there's some gear in it, as in the TV, that could be taken out. The important thing on that is, I think, is if the seller is not going to leave it and they're going to remove it and it causes damages, they have reinforced this statement here. The seller must repair any damage caused by removal of any items excluded above in a good and workmanlike manner. The seller will notify the buyer upon completion of such repairs and provide buyer with the documentation thereof. In other words, who fixed it or how it was fixed. So if something is removed, and since I'm talking about the electric car thing, we did have to have that removed, and there had some replacement, had repairs done, but we did not know to provide some documentation. But it's saying right here that if there was documentation, we would need to provide that. As you know, this is the list of the items that are expected to be left. They are telling you unpair and delete any data, and then if it's leased or not owned, then obviously you're going to have it noted here. And if any items don't convey, and make sure if it were a piece of exercise equipment or what other thing that might have been removed, like the electric car charger thing, you should note it right here. All right. So put everything in that contract so that it is bound to it. Okay, let's scooch on down here. And now here we go, looking again at these new words. The governmental compliance. That is a new term. It's not necessarily new to some of you who've been around legal contracts for a while, but it's new, being a topic heading and a focused topic. So in this particular thing, in this list, the property investigation. The buyer has a responsibility to do their due diligence. Yes, you have to help them a lot, but these are the items when you're talking to the buyer. These are the things all the way down here to X. These are the things that the buyer is responsible to find out during the due diligence period. Not only the inspections, that's the primary thing that we deal with, would be the inspections. Obviously, you want to review the documents, you want to find out about insurance, and be very cautious about insurance right now, because insurance has to be done like 2 weeks ahead of time. Don't think you can do it right at the last. You want to make sure up front, of course, appraisal survey. But right here, zoning, governmental regulation, and governmental compliance. Investigations of current or proposed zoning or other governmental regulations that may affect the buyer's intended use of the property. Adjacent land uses, planned or proposed road construction, and school attendance zones. And this is what's been added. And investigation of whether the property is in violation of any law, ordinance, permit. Oh my goodness, look at that word, permit, or government regulation as outlined in paragraph 8H. Now, if you will just hold on just a little bit, we're going to get to 8H, but I wanted to point it out to you. This is a buyer's responsibility to check out. All right. So you make sure the buyer understands that it is the buyer's responsibility. Now, the other thing I want to point out in this list of responsibilities, the special assessments. Nothing changed in the contract, but it's a reminder. Special assessments, particularly with HOAs, have become quite an issue. We no longer use the term proposed. We are now just using special assessments that have been levied, that have to be accounted for, and the seller has to pay for it at closing if it has been levied. But part of this governmental compliance issue has to do with things that are proposed. They're not classified, or they're not called proposed, but if there's any awareness of some issues, then our sellers are responsible to disclose it or fix it. All right. Now let's scooch on down here just a little further on our way down to 8. What is it? 8H. That's just some clarification of words there. We're not going to go into details on it. Okay, come on down here. Oh, this is interesting. Look at this. If a lead-based paint disclosure is required, when is it required? When do you have to use the lead-based paint disclosure?
I think any houses that were built prior to 1978.
Good job, Tom. Good job. You've been out of pre-licensing how long now? Oh, I won't ask. That's a
It's
pre-licensing
been a
question.
decade, almost 2 decades.
Good job. You remember any home that's was built prior to 1978 would require lead-based paint disclosure. There's not exemptions, guys. It's any home prior to 1978. Okay, if it's required, but not given to the buyer prior to the seller's acceptance of this offer. Look at that. The offer can be made. It should, and you would hope that it would be attached to the MLS, wouldn't you? Like your residential property disclosure. But if it's not, before the seller signs this agreement, the lead-based paint disclosure must be given to the buyer. All right. Or the buyer may not be obligated to purchase the property under this contract under federal law. Isn't that interesting? Somebody found a way to get out of the contract. I thought that was quite interesting. So make note of that. All right. Now let's get on down here. Oh, leases. Oh my goodness, leases. This is a new paragraph. Leases, the property is or is not subject to any lease. If the property is subject to a lease, The buyer and seller shall include either the rental income investment property provision in the additional provisions addendum, the one we looked at a while ago, or the vacation rental addendum. Have any of you used the vacation rental addendum? Well, one of our new forms is a vacation rental addendum to the vacation agreement. So we will try to take a look at that before we get through today, or it might be next Thursday or Thursday, 2 weeks. So in this additional provisions addendum, I'm not going to cursor all the way down there because it takes time to do, but in that addendum, and again, we will look at it, it does say, it gives you some information on the requirement to provide a copy of the lease. Also the information on the HOA. So take note here that you might possibly need that additional, and if there is a lease in place. We've been having a lot of trouble with getting people out of a house to sell them. Even when the sellers, we've had probably at least 2 contracts that had to be terminated because the seller could not get the people out of the house. Even one of them was taken to court and had eviction notice and everything and still didn't get out. So just be real cautious on those leases. Make sure a buyer, if you're representing the buyer, make sure that you have copies of the lease and stay very close to how they're going to get them out of there or when they're going to get them out of the house. Okay. The seller's obligation as far as the evidence of title, payoff statement, and non-foreign status. The attorney is going to explain that, but they did include a word here. So rather than documentation, they asked for the status certification, which if you are the seller's listing agent, make sure that you get this information to the attorney. If the seller does have a non-foreign status certification, okay? Because that's an IRS requirement that the attorneys have to address. Now right here, this is another addition. Good title, legal access. It says that the seller will execute and deliver a general warranty deed. There are times that it has to be changed to a special warranty deed. There are times that there are liens against the property that have to be, that a title insurance company might have to insure over. But be cautious right here, where it says that they will convey fee simple, marketable, and insurable title. That word has been added without exception for mechanical liens, lis pendens, monetary liens and judgments, and free of other encumbrances or defects that would materially affect the value of the property. We are seeing more lis pendens. It seems, I think we've had 3 this year, and I don't think we've had 3 in the last 10 years. So be cautious to know that the seller needs to make sure that they disclose if there is a lis pendens, if for whatever reason. So be aware of liens and judgments. The seller's going to have to be upfront, not try to conceal stuff. And here's your remedies. And one of them would be that it has to be specifically approved by a buyer in writing if they're going to proceed forward once these are disclosed. All right. Now here we are in this paragraph. Here's your 8H. That's all this new trying to understanding of governmental compliance. We're going to read through it and then we're going to talk through it. Is the condition of this contract that the property to be conveyed free of any material violation of law, ordinance, permit, or government regulation, including but not limited to those relating to the building, stormwater, impervious surface, environmental protection, and zoning, unless the seller has specifically disclosed such violations prior to the effective date. If a violation is discovered and identified after the effective date and prior to closing, then the seller may cure the violations unless otherwise agreed. If the seller does not cure the violations prior to closing, then the buyer may choose to accept the violations and proceed to closing, or terminate the contract and receive a refund of the earnest money deposit and the due diligence fee. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Now, let me take you to the legal Q&A that one of the attorneys did for us. And we're going to rely on what the attorney told us, not just what you and I can decipher with the words. This is a legal Q&A that John Waite, who is now general counsel for the North Carolina Realtors Association, he published this a few days ago. There are two safeguards in that paragraph for the seller. The first states that the property must be conveyed free of material violation. Material, that's your key word. Black's Law Dictionary defines material as of such nature that knowledge of the item would affect a person's decision-making process is significant and essential. All right, that's the Law's Dictionary definition. How many times, and maybe you haven't heard it that many times, but I have, a buyer would say, well, if I had known that, I would have never made an offer. Sometimes I wish they could find another script, but that's always the script when they come back and say there was something misrepresented. Well, if I had known it, I would not have made the offer. Or if I had known it, I wouldn't have whatever. This is an attempt to help buyers to know and be able to make their decision based upon what has been disclosed by the seller. Now, in our current contract, even if the seller didn't disclose, maybe a seller checks no representation, you know, as an agent, you have to disclose if you know. All right. This contract now is almost nailing the seller to say, you better be disclosing it. And if you didn't know about it, as soon as you do know about it, then between the effective date and the closing, are you going to correct it? If you're going to correct it, then the buyer would proceed forward with the contract. If you're not going to correct it, the buyer could choose to terminate. If they didn't want to proceed forward, they could choose to terminate, and they would be entitled to receive their DDF and their earnest money back. They would not be entitled to be reimbursed for any of their expenses. Now let's kind of meander on further through what John Waite has said. Once you know what material, what that means, it's anything that could cause a buyer or a seller to say, a buyer to say, if I'd known, I wouldn't make the offer. And he gave two illustrations here. The one I highlighted was had to do with not getting permits for, let's say, finishing a basement. He said, you know, if a seller's installed a ceiling fan, the seller doesn't need a permit to install a ceiling fan. Typically, they don't, unless they had to install new electrical wires, and that could possibly require a permit. But that's not basically what they're talking about here. They're talking about permitting the basement being finished. I don't know if the agent's on the call today or not, but we got one agent that's dealing with an addition. I mean, like a bathroom and 2 rooms that were not permitted. So, but they didn't tell. They didn't disclose. Well, the agent tried to get the permit, and you know, permits are only held on record for 6 years in most counties, and so there's no permits available. But the problem is that the seller didn't disclose the fact that it was done without permits. So we're going to have some more issues with permits based upon this. let's look at this right here. I added that little note too. The buyer should have a right to know about such as this addition, because not only could it be require permitting issues, but it would have potential tax exposure. And I'm thinking, what tax exposure? Because I was thinking income tax, and it dawned on me, no, it's real property tax. You know why a lot of people do not get permits is because when they add all that extra square footage, that's extra taxes on their real estate taxes that are levied, okay? And there's liability there. So the buyer should have a right to know. They may choose to proceed forward, but they may say, okay, the addition looks good and I get the contractor to look at it and everything looks good. But when it has to be noted for tax value, then there's some increase in cost, all right? Right here on the second part here, I just make sure the seller can simply disclose what they know about the issue and avoid the contract, this conflict of not being able to satisfy the buyer's material knowledge of material facts. So there's your two safeguards, all right? Now, let's look at this next section here. If a seller fails to disclose a material violation of governmental regulation prior to the effective date, where do you think they're going to disclose that? Residential property disclosure, right? And again, if they disclose it, then the buyer has a right to see that before he does the offer. Because they're again pushing agents to make sure that buyers have the residential property disclosure in their hands before writing the offer. And I know things have been going pretty fast and y'all haven't always been able to do that. But again, this is the push to put as much information in the buyer's hands before they write the offer. Now, it's between the prior to the effective date and the violation is discovered prior to closing. You all know that if the seller is made aware of some violation, something that could be considered misrepresentation, the seller has to go change that residential property disclosure immediately. All right. But now let's look at some clarification that they have put into this. Paragraph 8H is a brand new condition in the contract, much like paragraph 11, which provides that the property be in substantially the same or better condition at closing as on the date of the offer. Conditions, if they are not met, do not ordinarily result in a breach of contract, which is true of the paragraph 8H. If a material violation is discovered after the effective date, the seller can either remedy the violation or decline to fix it. Nothing says they have to fix it. If the seller does not remedy the violation, the buyer can either 1, proceed and close, or 2, terminate and receive a refund. That's what I just explained. Now, right here, make note of this. The buyer is not entitled to the reimbursement of the cost that may have incurred in the transaction. Their home warranty or whatever, maybe a structural engineer report, whatever they've expended, they're not entitled to the reimbursement. Let's see, right here, I wanted to point out, I think I mentioned to you a moment ago that in the previous contracts, the agent does have to disclose, even though the seller doesn't, but he says here, this gap between the seller's duty and the listing agent's duty was a significant risk management issue, where a listing agent could be accused of failing to disclose a material fact, even if they did not know or have reason to know of the non-compliance. So it's relieving the agent just a bit and putting the responsibility back on the seller to disclose these things. And once they are disclosed, they have the option to remedy it. I believe right here, the addition of paragraph 8H in form 2T, as well as the addition in the 12T, in the exclusive right to sell vacant and the exclusive right to listing agreement will help ensure the sellers make an important disclosure to the agent. See, that's protecting you, not just the buyer. So I really did like that. Okay, now let's scooch back up here to the contract. That gives you a little bit of more knowledge. And if you all did not get that, any of y'all want to, so if you want this whole stream of things that are highlighted, put your name and an email in the chat, and I'll make sure that you get it. Okay. Now let's see. The deed, taxes, and fees. An addition here again is the deed is to be made either to the buyer, to a corporation, limited liability, or other business entity of which the buyer is the sole owner or shareholder, or a trust. This was new. We've not had anything in previous versions that asked for the name of a trust, but we're seeing again many more trusts. Or it could be a relative of a buyer and or other, and the name that you would want to put here would be that person or that entity. Okay. Let's see. Let's scooch on down here. Possession. Oh goodness. We've got two new guidelines, and I wanted to point them out to you. We generally don't go through guidelines, but they rewritten the guideline to the buyer possession before closing, which helps to explain to the buyer the relationship between the buyer and seller is not a relationship of a tenant landlord when you're using the buyer possession before closing. They have not changed anything in the form itself, but the guidelines give you some more verbiage that helps you explain some things to the buyer about that particular form. There have been a couple of changes to the buyer possession. Again, we'll get to it, but just wanted to point this out in the contract. It says to make sure to have access to the property, the transfer of amenities and services, all keys, including mailbox keys. You'd be surprised how many times we don't have to hunt people, seller down to get a mailbox key for these condos or some of the planned developments. Make sure that these are given at the time of closing, if not given prior to closing. Okay, that's the deadline time. So you want to make sure you have those. If there's an electronic device of some kind on your garage door opener, make sure that's unpaired to that seller, but make sure you have the way to transfer the new codes or whatever. And as you'll see right here, what was added to this again was this note: parties should either attach the additional provisions addendum. Again, boy, I tell you what, the additional provision addendum is really getting a workout in this new contract, or the vacation rental addendum. You see this list of addenda here? This is where I say, don't you put that agreement in the bill of sale. Okay, these are the ones that would change the contract. The agreement and bill of sale doesn't change the contract. This is about the recordation. This was added. This agreement or any memorandum thereof shall not be recorded without the express written consent of the buyer and seller. We've had a time not too long ago where the buyer told the attorney not to record, and it held it up for a couple of days. And that, quite honestly, I can't even remember the reason, but it got hung up in that time, but we finally got it resolved. But the same token, anything that changes, it has to be by written consent by the buyer and the seller. The remedies, this paragraph was added I guess a couple of versions ago, but they have added just some more verbiage that in the buyers, if the buyer breaches, the liquidated damages that the seller has already agreed to accept would be the DDF and the earnest money, right? If the buyer breaches. So that is part of the seller's rights for the contract. But they've also now said that if there's there's some reference to dishonored funds, that also will be part of that remedy. That would be the seller's right for the buyer. Now, if the seller breaches, we have not had a time where if the seller breached that they have not been required to do the due diligence fee and the reimbursement. But we're finding more and more buyers, if the seller breaches, which is not totally unusual, if the seller does breach, then the buyers are proceeding with some legal action, and they have totally their right to do so. But you can't get into advising them on that. Your best advice is please talk to an attorney about this, because they can tell you the rights that's going to be financially feasible for you to do, and give you the legal advice that you need. The attorneys have put in this paragraph, the general statute noted it as for the dishonored funds. That's all that this is just added the reference to the statute. Now, this is a new paragraph here. This offer shall become a binding contract on the effective date unless specifically provided otherwise. Buyer's failure to timely deliver any fee, deposit, or other payment provided for herein shall not prevent this offer from becoming a binding contract. That's what we were talking about earlier. Provided that any such failure shall give seller certain rights to terminate the contract as described, as we talked about earlier on that form 355, and then it would be 352. Okay, if the seller did decide to terminate. So that's what they're referring to there. There's your wire fraud warning. Don't forget the wire fraud warning. Make sure they understand it. Here's that contract, this additional provisions. We have looked at it a couple of times, and we've referred to it several times. I mentioned to you a while ago about the rental section. This is some new words. All these are, that's in the yellow here. These are all new words. This one says the seller authorizes the directs any property management company and any attorney who currently represents or who has previously represented the seller to release to the buyer, the buyer's agents, representative, closing attorney, or lender true and accurate copies of the above items, as well as the rent roll, to include property address, amount of the current monthly rent, amount of security deposit, and all past due rent amounts. So because we're dealing with many more rentals situations, and sellers having tenants, and they need to have accurate records, and those accurate records again must be disclosed and must be put in the hands of the buyers. They added this section here. The seller shall deliver assignment of any lease at or before closing, and look at this, unless the lease does not permit assignment. What does that mean? That means you all better be reading those leases. All right. When you list the property, you need to be looking at those the leases. See if it can be assigned, or if it specifically says it cannot, then you may be out there advertising trying to sell something that can't even be sold. All right. So if you don't understand it, talk to one of the attorneys that you use a lot. Okay. And get in the legal interpretation of some of that. Right here, I think I mentioned to you before, you need to have the name, address, and telephone number and email address of any property manager or property management company for the property. You need the information you need, and you shouldn't have to be going hunting it. A seller should be able to provide that to you. All right. So put some more of the responsibility back on that seller. All means of access to the property, those keys, garage door openers, codes to the little box on the outside of the garage door. All those things must be delivered to the buyer at closing. And I'm not sure exactly where I read it, and I don't see it right now. My eyes not landing on it. But if there is a, you might have two property managers. You might have a condo property manager for the condo association. You might have a property manager for a master development. So you might have more than one property manager. Make sure you get the information and clarify if there are two HOAs, and make sure you get that information. Okay. Now, a few minutes ago, it said if there was some repairs to be done and the buyer wanted to specify how or which ones needed to be done for the remedy of that government compliance, this is the paragraph right here where you would write that. They've referred that to you. Oh goodness, where did my forms go? Okay, forms, we don't need you to do this. Okay, hang on just a minute. There they are. Shoo, worried me. Okay, that's all of that we're going to look at on that one. This is that article that I went through with you. I'm not going to go through it any further. This is the offer to purchase. That's for the vacant land. That's 12-T. There isn't anything different in it from the 2T. I did include it in the stack, but I'm not going to go through it because we've already gone through the 2T. Let's get on down here. Come on. Oh, the termination of contract. Remember, they changed the name. I believe it was last year. It used to be called notice to the seller from the buyer or vice versa. Now it's called termination of contract by notice to the buyer from the seller. And they've added a couple of things on the ones from the buyer to the seller and vice versa. Okay. The two things, and again, they clarified some words right here. Just rewrote this little section. This form unilaterally terminates. It does not require signatures. Let's see, this is to the buyer from the seller. Then it would not require a signature by the buyer. The seller is sending it to the buyer. Remember a while ago, we were talking about that form 355 and saying you need to pay up the next business day and get the funds in here. If they don't get the funds in and the seller does want to terminate and move on, it doesn't mean that they don't have a remedy to go after the funds, but it does mean that they can terminate this contract and move on to another contract. So right here are two provisions that have been added. The seller gives this notice of termination and alleges that the buyer has breached the contract. The seller is strongly advised to seek legal counsel before checking this box and signing this termination. If the money hasn't come in the business day, it's a wise idea for the seller to talk to an attorney, possibly the closing attorney, before he signs this 352, which unilaterally terminates the contract when it's communicated. All right. So that's why they're reminding them that it's alleged breach because the money hasn't come in and the attorney needs to advise. This one right here, the seller gives this notice of termination without providing a reason. The seller is strongly advised to seek legal counsel before checking this box and signing this termination. I'm not really sure, but honestly, why they could give a termination, a notice of termination without a reason, but I'm sure I'll be finding it out this next year if some of y'all get into that situation. But I'm not sure what that alludes to, just to be perfectly honest with you. But whatever the issue is that somebody's unilaterally terminating, they better be seeking legal advice. Okay, now this just reminds you right here, and again, this is added to the form. Buyer's failure to sign this release does not affect the validity of the seller's unilateral termination of this contract. Okay, so in other words, they don't need the signature. This is the converse. This is the termination of the contract by notice to the seller from the buyer. It also says this form unilaterally terminates the offer to purchase, and the same two provisions on the previous one have been added from the buyer to the seller. But look here, the property fails to satisfy the governmental compliance condition in the contract. Remember the one we spent so much time on? And you have the Q&A from the legal department. The seller decided he wasn't going to fix anything. He wasn't going to get it permitted, and he wasn't going to fix anything about what wasn't disclosed. So therefore, this buyer has the right to tell the seller they're terminating the contract. And remember, under the terms of that contract, the buyer would then be entitled to a refund of the DDF and the earnest money, but not reimbursement of any costs that other costs they incurred. Now, down here, it says buyer gives the notice of alleges the seller has breached this contract. The buyer is strongly advised to seek legal counsel. Again, don't practice law without a license, guys. We don't have that right. The notice of termination, if they have been notified, or if they feel the seller has breached, then an attorney is the only one that can advise them what to do at this point. All right. Then this statement here is the buyer gives this notice of termination after the expiration of the due diligence period without giving a reason. Every now and then, in fact, I talked to a lady right before we got on the call, and after the due diligence fee period, she had paid a sizable amount of money, and they decided not to move here. So there really was no reason, but now she wants her DDF back. And I'm thinking, I don't quite think that's going to happen, you know? So every now and then, from a buyer standpoint, I can see sometimes that they might not have a provision in the contract. And if they don't have a provision in the contract, they couldn't list why they're getting out of the contract. And I guess that's what it would be without specification. So, all right, we have again a reminder that the seller's failure to sign does not affect the validity of the buyer's unilateral termination of the contract. And you know what? We are right on time. I have finished the buyer's section. I can't believe this. Even with all of our little snafus, we got through it by 2:30. So I hope I'll see you all again on the 27th. We will just look at a few of these others. There's nothing major on the other forms. I told you about the guidelines in the buyer possession and the seller possession. You might want to take a look at that. And this vacation rental agreement and vacation rental addendum, pull that up. I don't have it where I can pull it up quickly, but if you pull that up, you'll see that we don't have that many B&B, Airbnb issues here, or not issues, opportunities, I guess. We have some down by the lake. We're seeing more. So you may or may not have an opportunity to use those forms like some other people across the state do, but you probably want to be aware of it anyway. I think people have kind of gotten into the idea that it might not be a bad idea to maybe rent out their house when we have, we used to, what is it still called Wells Fargo, Tom? What's the golf tournament? Is it still Wells Fargo?
Yes, it's Wells Fargo championship.
And you know, when some people, some people, they have a lot of people coming into town, and some people might want to rent out a house. Well, you might want to be aware of that in case they're maybe they're selling their house and they decide to rent it out before they decide to sell it. You might get in a scenario where you need to know if they have chosen to rent it out for the championship or not.
And that
But
also
again,
falls under the Augusta rule where they can
Yeah.
short-term rent it out for 2 weeks and not have to pay taxes.
that's right. My niece, no, it's my cousin's daughter. She's not my niece. My cousin's daughter does that $20,000 for that period. I'm thinking, whoa, I think I might move out of my house for $20,000, but now I think, no, I wouldn't. Oh, you're right. Good. But you all have been so sweet, and thank you for being with me today. Gosh, it's good to see you. And to know you all are being very conscious about the changes. I hope we've given you a little bit of explanation, and I don't know if the recording is going to be worth if we can get the recording or not, but we'll try to make what's available to you. All right. And thank you for putting your information in, and I'll send these highlighted forms over to you. And good to see you. Have a good day.
Okay,
Bye,
good
y'all.
seeing
Thank you,
you.
Sabra.
Bye.
Bye, honey. See ya.
Thank you.
Oh,
Go.
if you have any questions, I'll stay here. I'll stay on for a little while. If you have any more questions.
Sabra, I've got a question. This is Mary.
Hey, honey, what? What's that?
So back to this delay in delivering the due diligence funds, and it's considered a contract without the funds, but then it's considered breach of contract if they're not delivered on the effective date. So, I mean, I'm sure we all do allow a little bit of lenience, if you get a contract signed at 10 o'clock at night and the buyer's agent will say, okay, I'm delivering the funds the next day, but then they don't come through. And then all of a sudden the inspection pops up for, 48 hours. So can the seller at that point say that the buyer is in breach of contract so but the buyer hasn't delivered the funds yet, and it's 48 hours later, but they want to get the inspection done.
But you can't
So
stop
where-
the inspection. You can't stop the inspection. All you can do is give that form 355. You give the form 355 if the seller does not want to proceed forward. In other words, if the seller has decided they want to terminate the contract because they haven't got the money, they can't declare it a breach of contract. They have the right to give the notice to deliver the money, and if the money doesn't come, they have the right to terminate the contract.
Okay.
They can't
so they
declare
can
it a breach.
Okay, so they can terminate the contract. Are they
By
still
giving
due the
notice.
funds?
By
Are they
giving
still
notice.
by giving notice? Are they still due the funds?
Well, that's what
I mean,
they'd have to take to court. They'd have to take to court afterwards.
Yeah, and
So
I'm
that'd be a
getting
remedy.
mixed signals from people out there on social media land on whether the courts are upholding that or not. So
Well, again, I haven't seen a successful one yet, to be honest with you. A lot of it
to get
is
them
positioning,
it's just so
well,
they're not getting the money. Okay. All right.
I
So
mean,
they
if
would have
it's-
to terminate the contract.
They can terminate the contract, put it right back on the market and go with it.
Okay. Thank you.
They can do that. You're welcome. Any other questions?
Sabra, I've got a question on that bill of sale and personal property
Okay.
form, the new form. That's to be conducted outside of closing, correct?
No, you can do it at the time of closing, but it just doesn't affect anything on the HUD or CD or anything. The money can be brought in at that time. The money
Yep.
can be brought to closing.
Yeah, but in the past, that's between the seller and the buyer, and we don't actually have it, like you said, on the Alta or the HUD or anything like
No,
that.
No, it's
It's
not.
just an exchange of funds.
And this just gives us a legal document to do it with, rather than just writing what we normally write on a piece of paper.
Yeah,
But no, it doesn't even have to go through the attorney at all.
yeah, I imagine the attorney doesn't want to see that anyway.
Well, they don't need to be worried about collecting the funds or whatever.
Right.
It just means it's like anything else, it's settlement. And that would be the time you would want to make sure that this buyer has paid the seller the certified funds or paid, has paid it. I don't think that it has to be done at that day, but to me, that would be the opportune time to make sure that all monies had been conveyed at that time.
Yeah, that's what we usually do, and then
Yeah.
confirm that on the final walkthrough that they actually have left the stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and you know, the issue is when the seller possesses after the closing. Watch that. After closing, sometimes sellers forget what they agreed that they'd leave. So, like you say, you got to do that walkthrough and make sure all the things are still there that are supposed to be there.
Right.
Any other questions? Y'all are good. I love questions.
Sabra, this is Lisa. I get stuck on that permitting. Like a lot of times I'll be sitting at a listing and talking to the seller, and I'll ask if they had this or that permitted, and their response is it costs less than the required amount for them to have had it permitted.
Oh, I know.
And then at that point, am I just off the hook if they claim that? And then we're absolved of it if we ask the question?
No, you're not off the hook that you asked the question. They're off the hook if they disclose that they don't have permits.
If they
Yeah,
don't,
there's certain provisions in there that it excludes the monetary amount, like renovating kitchens and so forth, where you've got electrical issues,
Mhm.
relocating receptacles and stuff.
so say that again, Tom, what?
You've got the money issue, but like if they're renovating a kitchen or a bathroom and they move cabinets, then there's, then they're required to have a permit because it can involve GFI electrical receptacles.
So if they say they didn't, then all we have to do is just disclose that
They
permits.
don't have permits.
That permits were not pulled for projects completed at this house.
But see, that's under the current contract. You as an agent are responsible to disclose that. What we've got to make the sellers aware of now, they are responsible to disclose that, not just you. So they can no longer check no representation if they know something. They can't check no representation. They don't have a permit. They've got to disclose. The seller has to disclose on the property disclosure that they don't have permits, not just you being responsible. So that takes a little bit of the burden off of you as to how, where can you disclose that, right? So if the seller discloses they don't have permits and the buyer goes ahead and writes the contract, then the seller's off the hook because they disclosed that they didn't have it.
Okay. All right. I just find that to be one of the trickier ones.
It is. Oh, it is. Oh, I know it is. And again, we have been schooled for how long now that if the seller does not disclose what we have to disclose, yes, we do. And we still have to disclose. By the same token, if the seller wants to relieve himself of some responsibility of having to correct something, he needs to disclose it up front, not after he's found out.
All right. Well, I'm sure I'll be calling you later on with something.
Oh, honey, I'm trying to get all this in my brain too. And by the time I get this in my brain, I'm having to go back to the old contract.
Well, thank you for your time today.
You're welcome, dear. It's good to talk to you. Any other questions? Okay, you're off the hook. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
See you.